Hello, and welcome to the MS-720 exam overview. This section will cover the Monitor and Troubleshoot Microsoft Teams Phone portion of the exam. My name is Aaron Miller. I'm a technical specialist at Microsoft. I've worked with Microsoft's telephone solutions for the last 12 years in my time at Microsoft. I also was previously a Link and Skype for Business certified master, so I have a pretty strong familiarity with a lot of the topics we'll be covering today. Though things have changed a bit for Teams, there's still a lot of good fundamentals that are a part of the uh, SIP and voice and media and PSTN world. So let's get started. Quick overview. There are 4 components to this portion of the study guide. Uh, Monitor Microsoft Teams Phone, monitor and troubleshoot Microsoft Teams clients and devices, troubleshoot call failure and call quality, and troubleshoot direct routing and connectivity. Getting started with our first one here is monitor Microsoft Teams Phone. The first item up on the list is the configure tenant data upload for call quality dashboard and reporting labels. Hopefully everyone's familiar with this already. It is one of the kind of key fundamentals to making sure that you're getting good call quality data that is usable and reportable to uh, individuals who don't necessarily live and breathe by subnets of clients and need to understand a physical location and where that is in the world to relate the data. If we take a look over at the link provided, um, this can help illustrate the content for us a bit. So here, this section talks specifically about uploading the tenant data. These decks, I understand, will be provided, so hopefully that's available. If you didn't get a chance to download the deck, the names of these pages are in the recording here, so feel free to search those in your favorite search engine, and you should find the exact same articles that I show. So to upload the Teams data, you need to go to the CQD site, of course, which is a special dashboard site within the Teams admin structure. In there, there's a little settings kind of gear icon in the top right corner. You click that icon and there will be an option for tenant data upload. Once the data is uploaded, it does take a bit of time for it to get processed, so don't expect immediate results. They go through that in detail in this document, so please peruse it, be familiar with it. Another kind of key area is to be familiar with some of the limitations that it lists here about how you can upload the data. There's limits, only 1 million rows. Hopefully that's sufficient for everyone. And then what columns are required or optional and so on for each of the sites that are entered into the location data. So review this, be familiar with it. The questions won't be specific like what is the name of the column to define if a site has express route, right? Like it's not going to ask you to identify this column, but it will ask you to understand where you go to upload the site data, how you update that data, why that data is important. It'll ask questions that lead you to say, oh, the scenario needs this data uploaded to their CQD in order to improve the reporting or something along those lines. So be familiar with how to do it as well as why it's valuable to do it. And I can attest that it is very valuable. It is very hard to look at the data for people who aren't very familiar with the subnet layout of a network and understand it in real terms when you're looking at poor call quality for a particular site or a group of subnets that might be in the same building, etc. This helps you correlate and match that data very well. So it's very useful and should be entered for each tenant as they start using voice, which, just to point out, is well before you start adding PSTN phone capabilities to Teams. This type of data is useful for even meeting services that are happening with just Teams clients or Teams to Teams calls. You can still do all this great call reporting. You don't have to wait until you're doing it as a phone system. So by all means, use the call quality dashboard and upload your site data. Okay. Next section is configure the Power BI reports for CQD. So there's probably not going to be a whole lot of nitty-gritty detail on this question. What it will ask is that what it will look for is that you have familiarity with the steps required and what's involved in getting this working. So if we look through the article here, it will talk to you about the fact that you need to add the Microsoft Call Quality connector for Power BI, which is a download that you get. And it talks through the instructions here of where to place that file on your computer so that Power BI, the desktop Power BI, can access that and use it as a connector. And then once you have it in the right place, how to actually access that connector within Power BI and so on. So the steps are important. If you've never done it, the best thing to do to get familiar with any questions that may come up about this is to do it. Try it out, connect it. Personally, I think the Power BI reports are much easier to utilize than using the CQD dashboard or a built-in web page. Even though you can still make your own reports and things like that, there is a need to do it with Power BI for various reasons. Some are for publishing reports internally. It's a bit easier to do that with Power BI. It's also something that you can tie additional data sources to. For instance, there's a great blog article out there from one of the product owners that created this Power BI connector about how you can tie IP location data. There's downloads of IP location data for all public IPs that you can get. You can tie that data set to your CQD data and do a global map of where all the endpoints are that are connecting in your environment so that you can see as well as what type of call quality they're having. So you can see geographically where these things are happening, not just based on the site data that you uploaded, as we just spoke about, but based on the actual IP address that those clients were identified with egressing to the internet. So you can kind of illustrate and isolate those things visually based on how they interact with the internet. It's pretty cool. And again, there's other data sources, of course, you can tie it to Active Directory or various other things, but that's just some examples of why Power BI would be useful. The other thing to look at is up here on the Use Power BI. There's a list of the various reports that are available. And they're always updating these, so you should, if you start using this, you should check back often. But these reports basically are similar to the canned reports that are in CQD, and you should be familiar with what's here. Not necessarily a pro and con versus CQD and Power BI and such, but definitely know that there's a help desk report in Power BI so if there's a reference to that, you're familiar with it when it comes up, and so on. Great. The next item on our list is the Monitor SBC Health. Now, this one's pretty straightforward. It's not one that requires a whole lot of study, but it is one that I strongly recommend everyone go actually configure an SBC and play around with. If you have a demo lab or a test tenant or something along those lines, try to get your hands on with this so that you can be familiar with some of the interfaces. So we can see here that there's the overall health site for direct routing. It provides a list of the SBCs, and in each one there is there's a column for things like SIP options, the TLS connectivity, the health overall of how many calls have failed or succeeded going through this connection. And the last column can be pretty useful, which is the capacity of each SBC. So you can see whether or not they're getting close or have plenty of capacity, or they're failing calls because they are over capacity and so on. So this is the kind of general easy way to look at SBC health for your overall environment based on what's connected to Microsoft Teams. Our next section is monitor and troubleshoot Microsoft Teams clients and devices. The first part of this covers troubleshoot Microsoft Teams client data flows by using debug logs, media logs, browser traces, and desktop logs. That sounds like a lot of logs. The good news is a lot of those are all kind of one activity. It collects all those logs into one nice little zip file for you, with the exception of the browser logs, and we'll get into that here in just a moment. I do want to point out that you'll notice there's a lot of this log section is used multiple times. So this reference is very important. Definitely be familiar with how to get logs off of your clients. You should also learn how to get logs off of your devices, which is typically through the Teams Admin Center. For meeting rooms, there's some maybe PowerShell tools and things like that to use. I think Admin Center has come a little way in helping out there as well. But be familiar with how to collect logs from devices. In general, most of the questions tend towards the clients that user endpoints are on, which are going to be Windows or Mac or something along those lines. So here we take a look at how to get the log files. And the big secret here is, so you have debug logs, media logs, desktop logs, all great stuff to have. But the big secret here is the logging, the general kind of debug logging is on by default. If you would like to get the logs, you need to press Control-Alt-Shift-1 all at the same time, or build that key structure. Press them in sequence, but they all have to be depressed at the same time. So when all four are pressed, then it will deposit a zip file in your downloads folder, and you will have the various logs that are available for your client. One caveat here to note is your media logs will not be on unless you have explicitly told them to be on in settings, which is something that you have to that you will require a client restart to enable. So if you do need the media portion of the logs to understand, say, media failures, a camera blipping out in and out or something along those lines, you would need to enable that because it is off by default. Okay, media logs we just talked about. There was one other item. Here we go, browser trace. So the clients, you saw there was a different keystroke for Mac, but it's very similar. So those kind of four keys. So you get the client logs on the OSs that way. But if you're not using an installed client and you're using, say, a browser experience through Chrome or Edge, Chromium Edge or something along those lines, then you can get the browser trace to collect these logs. Well, not these logs, but to collect various logs about what's going on with your client or your connection or whatever activity it is that you're trying to debug at that moment. The Chrome Edge version here is and I believe the original Edge also. I'm not sure about Safari and Firefox, but if you've ever used F12 or even bumped F12 on accident in your browser, it's talking about those developer tools that pop up in your browser, and they can show you kind of the trace of a HTML and HTTP conversation happening for the page that you're on. So those tools are the ones that it's focused on in this client. You may see questions reference something such as Fiddler. It won't go into a lot of detail. They typically avoid talking too much about third-party products, even in the troubleshooting scenario, even if it's kind of the predominant tool to use, such as Fiddler or Wireshark. But they sometimes slip in with those as well. So be familiar with what other tools may be available, such as Fiddler. If you're doing packet captures, you would have Wireshark and so on. One other fun note is in browsers, you do have, in the Chrome-based browsers, you do have an ability to check the health of your WebRTC connections. So there's a fun little URL you can just put straight into the browser there, and it will pull up some good statistics and details for you about WebRTC on that client. Next up is troubleshooting configuration profiles. So largely this is a section that's going to talk about a client that isn't getting updates, not updates to the client, but it's not getting a policy update that you've applied, or a device that's not getting a configuration update, and troubleshooting that. Largely, the steps here aren't well documented, but they're very similar to troubleshooting most any other client-side issue, where you're collecting the logs and you're reviewing them. I do always recommend, even though this wouldn't be maybe a test answer, but I do always recommend you verify that things are configured the way you assume they are. Maybe even triple check that the right policies are actually applied to that device or user, and that it has been enough time for those to have replicated and come down to the client. It's always good to do a reboot or a sign in, sign out on the client, and so on. So you can go through those kind of initial troubleshooting steps, but if you really get stuck, looking at the logs is that next logical conclusion. Configuring notification and alerts. So this is actually a little bit of a new feature, alerting and notifications from the Teams Admin Center. So we'll take a look over here at the site. It walks you through pretty quickly and easily how to do this. Again, just like with many of these steps, I strongly recommend you try it out. It always helps to, when you get into a test, to be able to think back to when you actually did it, when you were, even if you were just doing it to play with a setting or configuration, you've seen it, you've felt it, you've actually modified something about it. It helps that memory and helps that stick with you. So always recommend go try it out. Currently, you can only do these notifications for the device health status. There will be more coming around things like call quality and so on, but right now that's as far as we go. So this is, as I mentioned, a fairly new section where you can set up these alerts. Looking forward to the improvements coming for certain. Monitor Microsoft Teams rooms. So a couple of things here. So overall, there's a Microsoft Teams health monitoring capability. So let's take a look at that. So here you can set up, again, these kind of rules to, and it goes back to that notify and rules and alerts. So you can monitor health of certain devices. So you can get an idea if they're up or down or having a failure or something along those lines. So this is a fairly new component of the monitoring of devices. The rest of the solution really goes towards the kind of two things, and it's unclear to me which one will be on the test more. There are originally, when Teams rooms came out, there was a monitoring service created that you could install an agent on the Teams room and run a service in Azure to collect the logs, analyze them, and report on them. They may still refer to that, though it was lightly adopted and is not really the standard direction that people are sent when they're talking about monitoring or supporting a Teams room. So be aware of it. Don't spend a whole lot of time on it. If you want to set it up and play with it, I strongly encourage it. It's good to get familiar with those kind of skill sets, but it's probably not the default answer. Just be aware that it could be the answer depending on what options you have. Use your own kind of judgments on the direction they're sending you. I'm hoping they won't put both the Azure monitoring service and the other alternative, which is the Microsoft Teams Room Premium license, which is kind of a managed service for meeting rooms. So that service provides some additional monitoring and reporting capabilities and alerting capabilities that will give you that additional level of monitoring. It goes beyond what was available in the Azure side. So likely if both of those are an option, it's likely that they're pushing towards the premium answer or the managed service answer. So I say premium because it's enabled by something called the Teams Room Premium license. It's not the Teams Room Standard license. So it's Teams Room Premium or the managed service are kind of interchangeable. The documentation and the test will probably say managed service, so just be aware of those. Review what the capabilities are, the links provided there. Those are good things to be aware of. I doubt they'll spend a lot of time on this in the test, but definitely something that could be there. Troubleshooting Azure AD sign-in issues for Microsoft Teams devices. This one largely is going to talk about Android devices. When they say Teams devices, they typically mean phones. Um, they could mean meeting rooms or Teams rooms, but usually they say Teams rooms or meeting rooms when they mean that. And there's slightly different tools. Typically, meeting rooms today are largely Windows-based, though there is an Android version of that as well. So these tools would apply that are linked here on troubleshooting Android devices. Um, so these are important. There are various things about Azure AD, the way the account's configured, especially when you have places where multi-factor or multi-auth is required. So those scenarios can wreak a little havoc for a device. So those things you should be aware of how to deal with those for like Intune or conditional access or whatever it may be. And this document does help with describe some of those scenarios and assist with them. I don't expect that they're going to want you to know how to configure anything special in Azure AD or configure the Intune controls or any of that. They're going to want you to be familiar with things that those products could do that will impact your team's devices negatively. So be aware of them, be familiar with how to troubleshoot and verify what the issue is so that you can get that addressed appropriately. The last item here is the troubleshoot user provisioning by using MCO validation error. And I'm going to admit, I did not know what MCO validation error was. I went and did some research and did not find a lot of great information out there, at least not from Microsoft publicly. So this one was a little bit of a research project for me. What I found out was mostly that MCO validation errors deal with hybrid environments where users' configurations are both on-prem and in the cloud. And when you're moving experiences such as maybe their phone, their enterprise voice capabilities to the cloud, you may have some issues setting uh, the configurations for that user in the cloud, and it could be caused by these validation errors. In general, everything I've seen leads me to believe the main question here is that they're hoping you can answer is how to identify when a user is having these issues. And this PowerShell command is the solution that I found in a few reference documents that weren't specifically about this, but that did touch on it lightly. So this is the simplest way to identify where these MCO validation errors are. The validation errors can deal with a variety of things. I doubt they're going to get into what validation error is caused by what or how to fix it or anything like that. I think they're mostly looking for you to be aware that validation errors can exist on a user account and that you need to look for those if you're having configuration problems because they will prevent you from applying policies or licenses or phone numbers or things like that to a user. So if you're having odd issues like that, check for these MCO validation errors because you might be having some sort of conflict there. That's the kind of key main point on that one. Okay, here we go. Troubleshoot call failure and call quality, part 1. So there are 4 parts to this. I apologize. It's mostly just so they're not little tiny eye charts to read on the screen. I don't use a lot of pictures, as you can tell, so there are a lot of words involved here. Some of these become a little redundant as we go through because some of them base off of the same techniques, such as looking at the logs. So we'll do a lighter touch if anything's kind of a repeat area, but for the most part, there's a lot to cover here. So once we get through this, there's just a little bit left. So bear with me. Here we go. Part 1. Interpret Microsoft Teams media flows. So this one is actually a huge one. I would spend a good amount of time. You can tell that this has so much in it with the 4 parts that this is going to be a core piece of the test of this portion of the test. So you want to pay some pretty good attention to it. If we take a look at the link here for the media call flows, what you'll find is that they have some really good diagrams further down in the drawing that start talking about the topology and the media flows for calls. So you'll notice they have users in different places, like on the internet. They have the Office 365 cloud where all the team services live. They have users. They indicate where firewalls are, and they even talk about the different legs of a flow. So you see here, there's various components to it, 2 and 5 and such, and they describe what these flows are here in the diagram. So then they go into the use cases, and the use cases will go through a bunch of scenarios. My biggest complaint with this document isn't that it's incomplete or any of that. It's vast. As you can see, my scroll wheel is pretty small over here. There's a whole lot of these scenarios, but they're not indexed well. Like, I would love to have the list of them over here so I can just jump straight to the say, customer network, external direct media, whatever that means. So I would love to be able to jump straight to this one based on the list over here, but instead we end up scrolling. So if you're focused on the media flows for when phone is involved, such as SBCs, you would be scrolling for a little bit, and I apologize for watching the scroll go through, but trying to make the point that here we get down to a section that's Teams with phone system direct routing topology. Great. So now you have things that are involving direct routing. You'll see the various call flows involved with all of that. You will also see that they show media and signaling somewhat differently so that you can understand when things are flowing a different way. Or when there's an optional, like it could go one way or the other, they may indicate that. It could go direct or get relayed or so on. So lots of good scenarios here. Highly encourage you to become familiar with all of them. Be at least lightly familiar with all these scenarios. Many of them start to feel redundant because it's just moving a user inside or outside the network, or both users, or all kinds of variations and combinations. But as you get into the more advanced ones, like when you start adding media bypass, so here we have media bypass direct from a user that's external, right? That starts to get a little more interesting. They even have one with the express route type of configuration. So if your environment has express route, or if there are questions about express route, I doubt there will be, but at least you'll have some familiarity with how that relates to the media flow of all these things. So very useful. Definitely review that, be familiar with it. There's not a whole lot more you can do with the media flow conversation other than be familiar with the possible media flows. Okay, troubleshooting call failures by using client logs. So the good news is we've already talked about client logs. Brownie points if you can remember how to get a client log off the top of your head right now. If you didn't remember, the answer is Control-Alt-Shift-1. So all 4 of those pressed together, and we'll give you a client log for a desktop installation. And from there, inside of that log, depending on why the failure is happening, you might be able to find out from the debug logs of what's going on in there. But it could be a media problem, and so you might need to turn on that media debug if it's not already on. So just remember, media debug is not on by default. So you want to turn that on before you do the log capture and try to get that information. And to be clear, when you press Control-Alt-Shift-1, it's a point in time right then of a copy of those logs. It doesn't start logging and then you do it again and stop logging. You press it, now you have a copy of the logs at that point in time. So you want to do it right after your issue happens, so the errors or the problems will be at the end of that log instead of somewhere buried in the middle. Troubleshooting the missing dial pad. There is a document here we'll take a look at real quick about this. Largely, it's about how to configure the dial pad. If you think about how to troubleshoot dial pad, there could be a need to go into the logs. It kind of goes back to that troubleshooting configuration or policy for the client issue that we had in one of the previous slides. But largely this comes down to the account not being configured properly. So it could be that it's not enabled for enterprise voice with the license. Could be that it didn't have a route assigned, or a phone number assigned or be homed on-prem or something along those lines. It could be that it has that MCO validation error problem going on. So there's all kinds of little nuances in configuration that you want to verify. That's usually the problem that's happening. If all those are perfect, you've triple checked, then you're looking at the client side of the house. You can take a look at the logs. Oftentimes it's a matter of the client having to sign out and back in or restart or something along those lines. Or it could just be a matter of waiting. Sometimes that provisioning, especially the initial provisioning, can take up to a day. So you're not going to see that instantaneous turn on once you assign a phone number. It could be a little bit of time. So be prepared for that delay before you start going into super detailed troubleshooting. All right, next up we have troubleshooting call failures by using the self-help diagnostics in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. So this one is actually new to me. I was playing around with it in my demo tenants after I learned about it. So let's take a quick look. What this is actually in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, not the Teams Admin Center. So just to be clear, it's in the kind of parent Admin Center, not the Teams, the product-specific Admin Center. And where you go is you go under Support and then a new service request. So as you get in there, you'll see, hey, what do you need help with? Now, usually what happens in this scenario is you're trying to open a case. You're trying to ask Microsoft support, hey, there's a problem, please fix it. But what they've done is they've added some diagnostic tools into here, which is what I didn't know, where you can have it run some tests for you to figure things out. So for instance, and they have a list of all the shortcut searches you can do to get to these tests. So for instance, if you need to test Teams Federation, here you go. Here's a test you can run. Let's do something with voice. Unable to make domestic or international calls in Teams. There's a test for PSTN here that you can run. So you can put these into that search within this under support in the M365 Admin Center, and it will bring up something that looks like this. It'll ask you for any information it needs, a user account or details about whatever it needs to run the appropriate tests, and then you hit run and it'll report back to you the results. The last bit here on part one is the troubleshooting tenant dial plans by using regular expression and PowerShell. I don't know that you really use regular expression to troubleshoot, but maybe understanding regular expression. The key here, though, is for troubleshooting dial plans in general or normalization rules or things like that, there are a few GUI ways to do this, meaning in the Teams Admin Center, you can do this for things like testing normalization rules and such, or seeing which routes apply to a user. So there is some admin capability there that you can go look and be familiar with. It might ask about that, but in my experience, they often, for questions like this, like to know that you know some of the PowerShell commandlets that you would need to use or could use. And in that case, the CS effective tenant dial plan is the magic sauce here. So if you don't know the dial plan for a user, you can do get on this. If you and this would tell you the effective dial plan and configuration for a user calling a specific number. And then you can test that and see what happens when they call this number. Does it get normalized properly? Does it go to the proper gateway that you want it to route to, and so on. So you can see all of that detail in this test. Part two, here we go. This one is all just one topic, so I'm not going to be bouncing around too much. Again, we're talking about getting logs from a client to do emergency service or dynamic E911, dynamic emergency address debugging. So if you're setting up emergency calling and emergency location detection in your Microsoft Teams environment, once you start having clients assigned an emergency calling policy, their clients will start trying to detect their location. With that, you may run into problems where maybe a subnet's not entered right, or the client for some reason isn't identified properly as the coming from the right trusted IP or something like that. So sometimes those can be difficult to troubleshoot, especially from an admin server side. So getting the client logs is definitely helpful in that. To understand, hey, I put all this great data in, why isn't it matching you, Mr. Client? And the client says, well, here's what I saw. And you can say, oh, well, that doesn't match here or there, so you can fix it. And then their client will start to match and will be identified. So the quick and dirty, and I won't read the entire thing to you, screenshot this, download the deck, whatever you need to do. This was not documented very well anywhere that I could find. There's probably somebody that's blogged it well or things like that, but I found this in a document that I thought would be useful, so I just took this snippet out. So once you have the log files from a client, you go to the MS Teams diagnostic log text file, open it up, and look for the IP address. Oops, I progressed, sorry. Look for the IP address there. Um, the if there, that will tell you the public IP that the client is reporting to the service. Then look for the endpoint address, and the endpoint address will tell you if the client is, if that public IP is a trusted IP, because then it will match to a site. And there's an example of when that, if that doesn't happen, there's an example of that here. So if that trusted IP is not, if that public IP is not a trusted IP in your emergency service list data, then it won't register, it won't let that client try to detect the location. If it is a trusted IP, then it goes through the rest of the process of identifying the location for that user based on whatever parameters you're using, such as subnet or um, wireless access point or switch port or switch overall max and things like that. So there's a lot of ways that you can identify those locations. There's even new ones coming. So be aware of this. Emergency services, especially in the United States now, are very important when you start turning on phone services. There are strict laws applied to this world now. So definitely you want to be able to troubleshoot this when it comes time. You want to have some certainty around this. So these are just some good getting started, looking at the data that's in the logs to make sure that you're getting it and that it's showing up properly, or if you're not, maybe why you're not getting it. Part 3 of the troubleshooting call failure and call quality. Interpreting E164 normalization rules in a tenant dial plan. So this kind of goes along with that one we had previously. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because we already talked about how these commandlets work. There are, again, some tools that you can use in the Teams Admin Center to do normalization tests and things like that. If you're not familiar with normalization rules after some of the deploy and configure sections from prior to this section, maybe go back and listen to those. Maybe go research a little on your own. The best way to know how to troubleshoot these is know how to configure them. If you know how to configure them, you'll be able to find the flaws, if any exist. And the key to these is definitely regular expressions. So having a good foundation of regular expressions and the way that they're used in normalization rules will go a long way to helping you understand any questions that come up in this regard. Okay, analyze reverse number lookup. This one is another one of those great examples of things that weren't documented very well. So here's the quick and dirty. It doesn't really need a whole document, though I'm sure people would love it if one was published. But the quick and easy, let's say, on this is the reverse number lookup for the client and the service go like this. It starts with what comes in the SIP header, right? So if it's a PSTN call in the SIP header, sometimes there's a name that's provided for caller ID. That goes through, then it checks Active Directory against that number and says, do I have a name for this number? Is there a contact or user that this aligns to? Then it will check against Outlook, right? And then it will check against your Teams contacts. So Outlook is a personal thing, Teams is a personal thing. So, and like a subset of the Outlook ones, right? Or a superset, depending on how you manage your contacts. But basically, it goes through this pecking order. And the odd thing is that will use the last one that matches. So if a PSTN call comes in and it has a caller ID that says uh, Bob Williams, great. Bob Williams calls coming through at 555-1234, but I have a Joe Williams listed in Active Directory. Joe Williams, for that same phone number, Joe Williams will now be the name provided as that call goes forward. Bob is forgotten because the last one that matched wins. If there's nothing in Outlook, then it would go to Teams. And if I personally, under Teams, have Joseph Williams for that phone number, then Joseph is what's going to show up when that call prompts. Troubleshoot Teams client media issues by using Microsoft 365 connectivity tool. This is one of my favorite tools. It's been around for a while. I've evangelized it a few times with customers, especially when they were just getting started using media across their internet because they were used to hosting everything on-prem and they're like, I don't know how well it's going to work over our internet connections. This is a great tool for that. And it can be used anywhere. It can be used from a user's house. It can be used from their office. It is a test that runs from an end user's point of view. So very useful tool. Check it out if you're not familiar with it. It's very straightforward. You click the link, you enter a little bit of data, and it runs, and it will tell you all kinds of great things about your network. The key about this for the test is be familiar with the types of data you get back. Most importantly, the data around voice. It's going to have things like jitter, packet loss, latency, etc. So all those great things that are very important for voice calls, it does a measure on from that client. There's some other factors as well that are very interesting and can impact greatly your overall quality of experience. So it is something that should be considered for all the facets that it tests. But the key for this test is likely just be familiar with the results it gets and how those can impact call quality. What might indicate good or bad results. Troubleshoot calls using real-time telemetry. I was a little surprised this one made it in. I'm gonna save the link here. We'll go to the advanced call analytics here in a moment. But real-time telemetry is relatively new, currently still in preview, so that it's in the test, which the test is in beta, so I guess that's fair. But since it's in there, definitely something you should be familiar with. A lot of it is very similar to what's in the advanced call analytics. The big difference is this comes through for calls that are actively happening right now. Um, it's not waiting for that end of call report about the overall quality of a call as the standard method goes. When this is enabled on a user, it has that all that user's calls, meetings, and so on report real-time feedback to the service to continuously update it so you know what's going on with their client, with their connection to the service, and so on. So if you do get that, executive calling saying, I'm on this call and it's all crackly, what's going on? You can actually look at it and see, oh yeah, I see that you're getting a really weak Wi-Fi signal. Can you get closer to where your connection is? And they move to another room and they go, oh yeah, it's much better, thank you. That type of real-time telemetry can assist you in those kind of key scenarios. It does require an additional license. So you'll see in the documentation for that link, the note about this requiring the advanced communications license to enable it. So let's take a look at the advanced call quality. So under advanced call quality, the big thing here is that you're looking at a bunch of data about a particular call or a portion of a meeting or things like that. But you get to focus on a specific user. So if a user calls the help desk, they can say, I was on a call and I couldn't hear the other person, but they could hear me fine. Was there something wrong with my computer or theirs? How can we fix it? Or they just call and say, it's all broke, fix it. And you have to go fish and find out what's going on. This will let you look up a specific user's call history and how their experience has been going. So how many good, how many bad calls they've been having overall. How you can actually drill into the specifics of one call. So you can find the bad one. It will be indicated in the call list of all their calls. And you can drill into it and find out if it was good or bad. Here in the example, this one is good. And it will show you when there's a bad call, why it was bad, by highlighting the section that was bad. Say it was connectivity on the other end, not your user, but the other person they were talking to. Maybe they had the bad Wi-Fi scenario or something. Maybe it was their headset was glitching out. All those will be indicated automatically for you. There's a whole bunch of data that gets captured for every single call, and this lets you look at it for an individual user on an individual call at a time, or even look at all the users that were in a meeting and then find each of their individual streams for that meeting to understand their individual experience. So the fun thing about call quality is in a meeting scenario, one user makes it bad for everybody because if they're the ones speaking. So their call quality can impact everyone, and so everyone reports it as bad, but it was really just the one person speaking having a bad connection. So you have to kind of look at that full set of data to really understand what's going on, and advanced analytics helps you do that. There are different roles of access of what people can get to, so it's important to take a look at the RBAC security within the Teams Admin Center. Troubleshooting call quality is a specific area within this document. I suggest you review it. It talks about what's good and what's bad, what criteria are looked for. If you're not familiar with that already, I do recommend it. Next up, we have the troubleshoot calls using CQD. So hopefully you remember we spoke about CQD just a moment ago when we got started, though it was about configuring CQD as opposed to looking at the actual reports that CQD provides. But now that the data has been uploaded to show locations better, instead of just subnets, you have buildings and sites and cities and so on. Now you can see near real-time feed, so about 30-minute delay on the aggregate of data in your environment. You can even get down to individual users, so it's a bit slower to do that through this interface than it would be in the advanced call analytics. It's a little harder to do this as a help desk troubleshooting scenario. This is more for data analysis overall, looking for trends, looking for hot spots, looking for problem products, and so on. What this looks like, these are the custom dashboards that are part of this call quality dashboard site, which is where you manage the location data that we spoke about at the beginning. The reports come up with showing you good, unknown, and bad calls, and then a little trend line of the poor call ratio. If you're not familiar with how to read call quality data, there are several really good YouTube sessions on this. A lot of them come back from the Skype for Business days. There was a Skype for Business online series that specifically covered CQD in multiple parts and went into immense depth on it. So get very familiar with CQD. It is crucial to having a good experience in your environment for call quality. And even if it doesn't fix call quality, it lets you know if there's a problem, and if that problem exists, what it is. So it's always nice to have the data to back you up when the user says, yeah, we're having really bad problems. You look at it and say, I don't see the problems. Can you give me more detail? Versus, yes, we're having really bad problems. We know, and we've engaged the network team already to address this or that. Or maybe it's the endpoint devices team we've addressed because we know the PCs in that region are very old and they need updated, or whatever the analysis may result in. But you can get a lot of insight about your environment from these dashboards. So be familiar with these. There are definitely some good templates in here to help you get a picture of what's going on in your environment. And don't forget that you can also do it with Power BI now by connecting it to the call quality dashboard service. Great. Part 4, we made it through troubleshoot call failure and call quality. The last two here are inspect PSTN usage reports for SIP call failures. This one's pretty straightforward. The link provided here tells you how to get to the PSTN usage reports and what all the columns within that report mean. So you can go through that analysis. One of the columns will report to you if there's a failure, what the SIP error code was. That's what this is referring to. If you're actively troubleshooting calls on, say, an SBC, you wouldn't need to go to this. But if you're getting reports well after the fact that, hey, I've had a few drop calls over the last week, you can come to the PSTN usage report, export that data, do an analysis and say, yes, I see that user had 5 calls that dropped for whatever reason is represented in the SIP error code. So you'll have that insight and that detail. You can also trace that down in the call analytics side of the house, but sometimes call analytics won't necessarily know if something stopped at the SBC side. They'll know more about the team's interfaces and services. So if you want that kind of SIP component of like the SBC's report back of the error, this is a good place to get it. Analyze QoS markers using a network trace. This is another area where they may talk about a third-party tool. So things such as Wireshark might come up, or any other network capture technology. Whatever they use, the tool's really irrelevant. They're not really going to pick on you about how to do network captures or packet captures. It's more going to be how do you analyze the packets to look for QoS tagging. So there are several places out there that will show you packet captures and where to look specifically for them. They're not going to try to trick you and say, haha, we put it in the wrong part of the packet in the graphic. It's not going to be a gotcha type of thing. If they're showing it to you, the question's probably going to center around something like, is it the right number for the QoS to be configured as? So for instance, are you familiar, they're asking, are you familiar with what DSCP values should be set for audio or for video? So this document, I would say QoS and Teams, get familiar with this because this is going to give you the insights into what likely they're going to ask you about. They're not going to talk too much. There's probably a different section around configuring or preparing for voice and things like that about how to set up QoS. It doesn't hurt to get familiar with that, especially if it was already covered. But for troubleshooting, it's not too much about setting it up. It's more about verifying that it exists. And if it doesn't, finding out why, which could be, that a router along the way is stripping the DSCP markings off or something like that. So there's all kinds of nuance to it, but in general, the questions usually center around knowing how to verify by doing a packet capture and what it should be set as. And that's kind of the key. It may sometimes get into port ranges and things like that, so be familiar with those as well, but I haven't seen that type of question in a while, so with that level of detail on QoS. So, but be prepared for it. You may never know. There's definitely a good document to be familiar with. Okay. Next, we have troubleshoot direct routing connectivity. I believe this is our last section, so we are nearly done. Here we go. Troubleshoot firewall issues for direct routing. Again, not a section they're similar to the packet capture one, right? They're not going to ask you to get into a firewall's logs and look at what's blocked and not and all of that. They're not worried about your skills to go into things that aren't Teams related, that just involved. What they're wanting to verify is that you understand what needs to be open and closed for direct routing. So if you follow the link here for planned direct routing, hopefully you're already familiar with it from a previous session, but if not, we'll take a look at the site right now. And here we'll see in the site a list of ports. Actually, right here, you can see there's all kinds of stuff: infrastructure requirements, licensing, SBC domains, the trust certificates, FQDNs, ports, ranges. So these last couple are probably the most important for a firewall conversation, though I will say certificate has been one that's been a problem more often recently for me than firewalls. And if you didn't hear it originally when setting up the SBC, and the configuration side of the sessions, The SBC domain name has to be a domain that you have registered in the Office 365 tenant. You can't just make a willy-nilly domain up like sbc.contoso.com unless you have sbc.contoso.com registered in your tenant. Okay, so if we take a look at the ports, right here it'll tell you for SIP that you're using a specific port range, and for defined on the SBC. So it's telling you both directions. So this is from the service talking to your SBC, and then this is from your SBC talking to the service. So that's the signaling side, right? But as we all know, calls have two parts, signals and media. So if we keep going to look at more, we'll see the port ranges, and here we'll see a wider range of source ports going to what you define on the SBC for media ports. And then again, back the other way from the SBC, what you define to a specific set of ports in the Microsoft 365 service. Now, thing to remember here is that Microsoft recommends you do 2 ports per concurrent call you're supporting through that SBC. That's because every call, at least any good call, has 2 ways of communication, right? It's 2 people talking. So there's a line going out and a line coming in, if you will. So there's always 2 ports required to enable that. The next piece we have here is troubleshooting certificate issues for direct routing. There wasn't a whole lot of good documentation on this, but there is a tool, and likely they'll ask you to be familiar with the tool. So beyond just knowing what the certificate requirements are, that the name is correct and all those types of things, which are pretty standard fare. I'm going to assume most people are comfortable with that nowadays. There is a tool here. We'll just open this up and take a look at it real quick. This tool will test, it's called SIP Tester Client Script. It will test calls from where you run this script to this, it'll tell the service to call through your SBC and make a variety of test calls. And it will test things like putting calls on hold, escalating the media, transferring the call, and so on. So an inbound and outbound. So it'll test a variety of things. I think it asks for like 2 user accounts to be able to do all of the testing. So there's a little bit of setup involved. Definitely read the documentation. I think the key to this one is be familiar with the capabilities of this tool to help validate your SBC configuration. As for specifically about certificates, the other key is to be familiar with what the requirements are for certificates on the SBC. One note here is the second script that's listed to test 1 or more host certificate states on a targeted port. This is not going to be on the test. This is a script that I created while working with a customer that was validating their initial SBC deployment. We ran into an issue where their certificate on the SBC had been revoked by the authority because it had been reissued, and they didn't know this for a period of time during the grace period, and the CERT on the SBC did not get updated. So after the grace period was over, in the middle of the night, suddenly all the calls stopped flowing. Everyone thinks nothing has changed, the CERT's still healthy, so it was very difficult to troubleshoot based on all the assumptions. I created this script to go from any point, at least any point that was allowed to talk to that SBC based on firewall rules, and check the CERT that was assigned on those ports that they defined to make sure that it was offering it up and that it was offering it up on the right TLS configuration. So it tests a variety of ports talking to that client, a variety of encryption layers talking on that port, and verifies that that CERT not only has the right names on it, but that it also has that it is also valid with the provider still. So it will actually check to see if that CERT has been revoked or not. So pretty useful. Definitely not going to be on the test because I wrote it and it's It's only been used by a few companies to my knowledge. So, but I did want to share it as it was very helpful to get a particularly difficult scenario resolved. So, troubleshooting SIP options issues for direct routing. So if you remember, one of the earliest items that we talked about was the monitoring the health of direct routing. So that dashboard will actually tell you the health of if SIP options are healthy. But beyond that, you can actually come here and look into some more details about what's going on with the SIP options. So this actually will help you go to run the diagnostic test that we talked about from one of the previous question areas about running from the support section of the admin center, the M365 admin center. So this is a link to remind you that you can have the service do this test for you. It also talks about how SIP's options are used in your environment. So it'll go through some details here. It'll talk about how the decision's made to pick a particular SBC, and then it'll give you kind of a logic example here, like the SBC paired at 11, then options start every minute after that, and then the user makes a call, and then it goes to the rest of the scenario. So this is good to be familiar with about how options are used and what impacts they have. But the health and monitoring is really back on that direct routing configuration site within the Teams admin center, where SIP's options was one of the columns, and it would tell you if that was healthy. And our last item here is the investigate and diagnose calling issues by using an SBC trace, SIP trace. This one's probably one of my favorites. The goal here is to say that sometimes it's not a Microsoft tool you need. It could be that you need to look at the logs from the SBC's point of view. Each SBC, certified SBC vendor, has their own tools to analyze their logs. So being familiar with those tools or having someone that works with your team that is familiar with how to get those logs and analyze them is definitely recommended. If that's you, great. For the purposes of the test, they're not going to go into any particular vendor's tools to analyze SBC logs. The questions will be more geared towards knowing that you know when it's time to go look at the SBC logs as opposed to continuing to run down client debug logs or running the service diagnostics or opening a support case and so on. So the trick here isn't necessarily knowing how to read all the SBC logs that you could possibly have to work with. It's more about knowing when it's appropriate to go to that level in order to get the answers you need for the issue you're troubleshooting. Okay. I believe that wraps us up for the kind of key areas that were identified for this section. I do have a couple of additional resources that I wanted to share. Again, this deck should be made available, but I also put the URLs of each of these hyperlinks underneath them. So if you don't have a chance to write them down, you can screenshot this and go type them in if needed. That would be unfortunate, but it's possible. The very first one is a deep dive on Teams Voice by a lady that is a colleague of ours at Microsoft, and she is one of the best troubleshooters of all things PSTN and voice in Teams world. So listen to what she has to say like it's gospel. It is always good to hear how she describes things in the way that she operates. So definitely highly recommended that you watch that video. There are several others out there that will talk about how various parts of the technology work if you care to go look for them. Um, just start letting your fingers wander or let the recommendation engine follow up with you after you watch this one. Teams PowerShell and Skype for Business Online PowerShell, definitely recommended, as I said previously. Be familiar with all the commandlets. You don't have to know every single one by heart and what it does and all of its syntax. You should just be familiar that it exists. So you know when you see it that it's a real one as opposed to a made up commandlet. And a little trick for how I initially learned the commandlets was to look at them in their family of command, not grouped by their verbs. So for instance, CS get online user, I'm sorry, CS online user. There's a get and a set, right? So there's two parts to that. There's always kind of a combination with most commandlets that you'll see multiple verbs aligned to it. So there might be a create, an update, and a remove, or new, set, and delete, or something along those lines, of a set of verbs that go with that particular commandlet. So learn the commandlet, the core of it, like typically the new or get, or I'm sorry, new or set or create, those are good ones to start with, and then find its related verbs, because those are pretty obvious. Delete, remove, obvious what they do, right? New, create, or get, those are pretty obvious. Sets, all that stuff. So once you kind of find one of the core veins of the command, all the other verbs that are related to that command are pretty easy to determine the key on. So you don't have to learn every single one, all the variations. Just kind of learn that core one and what verbs go along with it. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but that's what's helped me with the PowerShell side. Um, Planning your voice solution in Microsoft Teams. If you haven't seen this site already, this is definitely a highly recommended one. Hopefully you've seen a lot of it already in the previous sessions, but understanding how to set this stuff up is key to understanding how to troubleshoot it. If you don't know how to configure it, you won't know how to troubleshoot it. Just because you can look at logs doesn't mean you understand what you're seeing. Knowing how to configure the things lets you know when you see it in the logs what's good and what's bad. Is this a good configuration or not? And so on. So I strongly believe knowing how to make it work, how to set it up initially, is core to being able to troubleshoot effectively. And then the last and probably most important thing is there are public learning pathways available for these sections. Highly recommend you go do those, run through them. So they're not too onerous. They do have a lot of good insight in them. So definitely recommend using the learning pathways there to take you to your next level of preparedness to take the test. And thank you. This has been a review of troubleshooting for calls and call quality for Teams Phone for exam MS-720.